Yeah?
We've got these images of Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman leaving Rashtrapati Bhavan on her way to North Block and then to Parliament to present the fourth union budget in her tenure. So far, India's had 23 finance ministers. It started back in 1860, and from then on, it's interesting that Nirmala Sitharaman will be the 8th finance minister who's had an opportunity to present 4 budgets. And in some senses, she has come into her own. Shankar, you've seen so many different finance ministers. The ups, downs, good budgets, not so good budgets, like the retrospective tax budget of Pranab Mukherjee. Initially, she seemed very ginger. She seemed a bit, like the occasion sometimes seemed to overwhelm her. But she has grown in confidence and has settled now into what is just another budget for her. So that whole halo that she had, the fear that she had about that everybody's looking at her, she's something that she's now pretty used to, and it's just another budget for her.
Well, I was thinking about this morning. This would be probably my 31st or 32nd budget. In the whole course, she probably was one of the more conscious, sensitive finance ministers. And that's because you remember that she was pitchforked into high position first as defense minister and then brought in here. And somehow in the initial stage, there was always this rumor that, she might be there temporarily or she might be moved or whatever. But there is much broader acceptance of her performance since last year and since last year's budget. And this year, she's definitely come into her own. She's also got a good team, and that makes a lot of difference in terms of confidence. And the one consistency in her thing is that the Prime Minister has always backed her.
And what's interesting is this is a meteoric rise. When you look at Nirmala Sitharaman, I recall 2012, Gujarat elections were going on, and she was there in the party office as one of the spokespersons of the BJP. One of the spokespersons of the BJP did a very good job as party spokesperson. That's all she was. She was at the same level at the time as all the other spokespersons in the BJP, the Shah Nawaz Hussains, who in fact had been a minister in Mr. Vajpayee's cabinet. And Nirmala Sitharaman wasn't even an MP at the time. Now, exactly a decade later, from 2012 to 2022, one of the many party spokespersons has already been the defense minister of the country and now the finance minister of the country. So it's a remarkable meteoric rise that Nirmala Sitharaman has had within the BJP. I can tell you it sparked a fair amount of envy within a section of the BJP.
That's the finance minister trusted by reaching Parliament. I had an opportunity to ask 2 of the most important people in the country around the time of the reshuffle whether there was any buzz of changes in critical ministries at Raisina Hills. And the one thing that they said is that they have a lot of confidence in Nirmala Sitharaman. So she carries the confidence of the Prime Minister, of the Home Minister, and she really is blue-eyed in many ways for the powers that be in the BJP at this moment.
It's interesting. She doesn't have an independent political base. She comes from Tamil Nadu. Her husband has been very critical of this government. But Nirmala Sitharaman, I think both as defense minister when she held her own in the context of the attack that the opposition had on Rafale, and now in the context as finance minister in very tough times of the pandemic, I think she is a kind of perfect minister in this government. The Modi government likes efficient administrators rather than politicians as ministers. And that's an approach which has its drawbacks, because then the minister doesn't command an independent base of his or her own. But the advantage there is that that person will be seen as someone who will fall in line and will, in a way, conform to what the Prime Minister would like to see. There is criticism from time to time that it's the PMO which runs the Finance Ministry and not the Finance Minister herself. S.C. Garg, as someone who was Finance Secretary in an earlier time, is that true? At the end of the day, how much autonomy does the Finance Minister have in a Modi government which is very PMO-centric? Mr. Garg? Okay, we'll try and go back to Mr. Shamika Ravi, if you're with us, you want to take that? You've been with the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. One of the criticisms is the council doesn't meet often enough. The Prime Minister doesn't attend enough council meetings. Is this a government where the Finance Minister has the autonomy to shape the budget, or is it still very much a PMO-driven budget?
Well, we have clearly seen in the last budgets that she has presented that despite, remember, BJP's outlook on the economy is also very left-leaning in its, in its revealed preference. If you just look at the, the path over the last, let's say, 8 years. But Nirmala Sitharaman has clearly, especially in the last budget, I think she has very clearly broken off from there and not shied away from, very contentious and taboo issues like privatization. So I do think she has a mind of her own. She definitely has the blessings and full support of the Prime Minister. But I do want to, there's a small anecdote that I do want to share since you're talking about her. When I first moved to Delhi, one of my public lectures was in the University of Chicago, the Delhi Center. And it was on women in politics and why policies matter as far as promoting women within political parties. And she came to attend that lecture. And her comment at the end was that, I am a product of BJP's internal policies of promoting women. Mm-hmm. And, it did come across as someone who is extremely humble and very quick to learn in terms of, what is expected, and an extremely mature personality, given how noisy Delhi is. She clearly stood out right from the beginning. So I'm not surprised at all that, senior leadership within the party has put so much faith in Nirmala right from the beginning.
Let's, on the word clouds that we have, since Shamika spoke about the speech thrust analysis of past finance ministers, the Data Intelligence Unit at India Today has actually looked at different speeches. So I'll start with 2020-21, Nirmala Sitharaman. The thrust at that time most acutely was on agriculture and farmer. Those words spoken of 26 times each. Ayushman Bharat was another critical thrust, finding mention 17 times, education 14 times, water through the Jal Nidhi, another critical priority of the Prime Minister, spoken of 13 times. If we cut to the last speech, which is 2021 and 22, here you've got infrastructure being the big thrust for Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, which she spoke of 29 times. Linked to that is transport. That word featured 28 times. And because this came in the middle of the pandemic, health was amongst the sectors that was spoken of the most, been spoken of 25 times. And then, of course, Corona featured 16 times. And then there is Atmanirbhar Bharat, which was spoken of 14 times. Agriculture spoken of 12 times, the farmers spoken of 11 times. So if you add agriculture and farmer, that's 23, making it one of the words that found mention most frequently in the finance minister's speech. Udayan, the government has had to pull back its much wanted farm reforms, given the fact that you've got elections now in Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Punjab and elsewhere, and then later in the year in Goa, very little chance of any aggressive farm reforms being pushed through by this government in the near future or even in the long-term future. Given the political sensitivity, when contrasted with the desperate need to reform Indian agriculture, what room for maneuver does the finance minister really have when it comes to the issue of what the government can do to support agriculture and economic and agricultural growth?
It's a tough one, Rahul. I would say, instead of announcing new schemes on agriculture, stick to what is working. There was talk about Narega, and you talk about most of the agricultural belts. What has really worked last year is the uptick in Narega, more than any other farm scheme which the government might have announced. And there was criticism earlier about announcing too many schemes and implementing them properly. I would say look at Narega as an example, where you started the year by saying, I will spend 73,000 crores. Already you've spent 77,000 crores. And there is a huge demand, given the lack of jobs in rural areas, for more Narega. So I would say, why 100 days of work? Why not make it 150 days of work and increase the outlay of Narega? Because that is clearly one avenue where there is an incredible amount of demand in rural areas. So I would say, stick to policies or stick to schemes which are actually working, for which there is a serious amount of demand because of lack of jobs, rather than creating new schemes. Because the government's problem is one of administration, not necessarily of intentions or of announcements. You spoke about the fact that Nirmala Sitharaman mentioned education 14 times. You know what was the outlay last year in terms of budget outlay on education? It was 93,000 crores. Now, what kind of public spending is this on a sphere like education, on the size of budget that you run? You earmark a paltry 93,000 crores to education, and then you mention the word 14 times. So I don't think this is about announcements. It's about what you can get done. Yesterday, Nilkant Mishra was talking about the fact that 2.5% of GDP is lying in cash with the RBI. So you can announce any amount of capex and schemes, but you're not able to spend what you have announced to the tune of 2.5% of GDP. 5 lakh crores is lying with the Reserve Bank in terms of cash. So I would say in this budget, my focus is not about what new schemes or what new announcements she can make for any sector, including agriculture, but actually spend what you're promising or committing to spend and use the channels which are working for you, rather than trying to create even more channels which you don't have great administrative lean over.
Getting Ketan Dalal, Naushad Forbes joining us. We want to get you to respond to what is it that you're looking forward to in this budget? Naushad Forbes, why don't you pick it up first? Udayan set the cat among the pigeons, saying this is not a budget that should be about those who've licked the cream, not for those at the top of the pyramid, but for those at the bottom of the pyramid. What do you think is something you're looking forward to, Mr. Forbes, for you would be an important element in the budget this time?
I do agree with that view. It's important to recognize what impact the last 2 years has had on the economy. Larger companies are doing just fine. Companies with good positions are doing just fine. The people who've really been most affected are those who were in urban informal employment. So sectors like retail, hospitality, tourism, these are the sectors that not only were the most affected, but they're also the sectors that have been the most vibrant in terms of employment creation for the last 20 years. So that's really where we need to see a greater focus. What can the government do in these areas? And we have to be clear that the government has a limited role that it can play in actually stimulating demand for services such as hospitality and tourism, such as retail. What can it actually do? It can spend on infrastructure. So the most direct way in which the government can employ people and put low-skilled people to work is through really rapid deployment of infrastructure. So what I will be listening to in the budget speech is not announcements of the infrastructure pipeline and so on, which have already been done, but how will that pipeline start actually delivering a high flow of rupees on the ground that is spent and therefore employing people and turning into productive infrastructure for the country. Second, I will be looking at the kind of not just words, as was pointed out earlier, but the actions for education and health. Education and health, especially school education and public health, are state subjects under our constitution. So again, the union government has a limited role to play, but it can play a very important role by using finance to actually incentivize the right actions, the right programs by state governments. So the new education policy has an excellent scheme, an excellent proposal to ensure second standard outcomes for all children around the country. Hearing something about that in the budget would be most welcome to me.
Mr. Dalal, what are you looking forward to?
Yeah, so I think primarily from the perspective of direct taxes and picking the baton from where Naushad left off, the smaller organizations, the MSMEs, today are normally in the form of partnerships or LLPs, and they pay tax at 36%. Compared to that, companies pay at the rate of 25%, which is a very competitive rate. So I am hoping that there will be some rationalization of rates on partnerships and LLPs. So that's one part. The second part is, even for individuals, the tax rates are quite high. The maximum rate of 30% kicks in for incomes about 10 lakhs, and I think that's a very low threshold. It needs to be enhanced. And of course, when you go above 50 lakhs, etc., the rate of surcharge takes the tax rates to 34, 36, 39, and then to 43, all of which are punitive rates, and that needs to be rationalized. We have also had talks about standard deduction, but when the rates and standard deduction are overall rationalized, I think the bottom line is that the overall tax burden should reduce, because that will also spur consumption. One more aspect is, business reorganizations are, the tax issues on business reorganizations are quite heavy. So, for example, conversion of a company into an LLP, the conditionalities on demerger. There are a variety of provisions which are extremely restrictive. And one wishes that these kind of restrictive provisions and very detailed definitions are diluted and business reorganization is facilitated. One last point I wanted to make was, today you have so many disputes in law that I think it is very important that at all three stages of the dispute chain, so for example, prevention of disputes, the actual disputes itself, like the appellate process, and then the other dispute alternative processes, they need a lot of focus. We had an advance ruling scheme which didn't work. That has been replaced by another one which has not worked at all. So one really wishes that the advance ruling schemes and the dispute resolution schemes are meaningfully implemented, because this is again an implementation issue, with an ecosystem that incentivizes fair and quick decision making, and you don't need to look all the time over your shoulder. So I think these are some of the issues that one would hope.
So stay with us. We've got these pictures of the Prime Minister reaching Parliament now. He's flanked by Dr. Jitendra Singh in the Prime Minister's office. Udayan wants to come in and ask a question. Udayan, go on.
Yeah, Rahul, I had a question for Naushad, because I heard Ketan Dalal just talking about the fact that taxes at the higher end of the pyramid should come down. Naushad, what's your thought? I mean, you spoke about inequality and the fact that the lower end of the pyramid has been hurting a lot. Does that make the case for progressive taxation strong? I mean, corporate taxes have been cut to 25%. One can understand that because companies create jobs. But what about the wealthy? I mean, at a time when the wealthy have got wealthier and the poor have got poorer, should there be a case, or could there be a case for taxes like a wealth tax, inheritance tax, or even a higher capital gains tax? Because people are making quite a bit of money even through difficult times. Should money be taken away from them and redistributed? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the argument that was being made was for a cut in income tax rates. I would be a beneficiary, but I don't believe that the current timing is right for anything like that. I think at present the best tax policy is actually to leave tax rates untouched. That if you actually leave them untouched, you will end up with a stable environment, which ends up being more secure from the decision-making perspective. Now, in terms of your question on wealth taxes and so on, I think you should look at our history and look at what they actually resulted in. Did it actually lead to buoyant revenues, or did it lead to activity at the end of the day that was counterproductive from an economic perspective? And it seems to me that the data would show that it was very counterproductive. And you may have taxes that sound like good taxes, but they're actually ineffective. Look at our history. Look at from 1991 through to 2017, we saw successive reductions in income taxes. With each round of reduction in income taxes, tax collections went up, right? So that's what you're interested in. You're interested in tax buoyancy. You're interested in more collections. And if you actually incentivize the creation of wealth, that's what you'll get. Having said that, I come back to the point earlier that I don't think this is the year for a tax cut. I think sticking with the existing rates is the right thing for now. When the economy improves substantially, when we are creating employment at the lower end of the pyramid in a widespread way once again, I think that's the time to go back and look at tax rates afresh.
Shamika, you want to comment on that, on whether there is a case for taxing the people who are actually doing quite well in the economy and trying to redistribute that? If the wealth tax is an inefficient tax, that point is taken. But is the case for some kind of progressive taxation higher than it's ever been before?
Dr. Ravi, did you hear that? Okay, so we've got these pictures of what's happening in Parliament. Prime Minister Modi reaching the cabinet meeting, which is customary right ahead of the budget currently underway, and in a short while after that, the budget will be presented in Rajdeep. There isn't much time, only till the 11th of February in the first part of the budget session. Then there's a recess because of the elections, and they convene around the 14th after the counting on the 10th of March. But there will be the Pegasus issue, which the opposition is very keen on taking up. The Prime Minister said yesterday, talk about anything you want, let there be healthy disruption, let there be healthy discussion, but let's not have undue disruptions.
Freudian slip, let there be healthy disruption,
No,
because that's probably what's going to happen. You know, you're probably going to get disruption starting tomorrow. But, you know, the one point that we haven't looked at, therefore, is that this is a budget in the shadow of elections. In a week from now, you have 5 weeks of elections, including in India's most populous state, the state that is most crucial to the BJP's future, i.e. Uttar Pradesh. So, last time the budget was in the shadow of the farmer protests. This time the budget is in the shadow of an election. So there is a certain element of political calls that are taken which at times affect economic decisions. And I think that's the worry. That's been the concern of all budgets of all finance ministers over the years, that we are in this endless cycle of elections. So one eye is on ensuring that you have these headlineable points that influence electorate, particularly I think in this election, the rural electorate. You've got Punjab and Uttar Pradesh, more specifically Uttar Pradesh, where there has been a large amount of farmer unrest in the last year. And jobs are a critical issue for the young. You've seen youth unrest in states like Bihar. So I think for the government at the moment, there will be, if not one eye, certainly half an eye on the elections. And that can influence budget decision making at times. At least you need to give the sense that you've created a budget which will get the voter to believe that the government is on the right track. But Udayan, a question that a friend has asked me just now, please ask Udayan, what are the sectors to look at in this budget which will kickstart the markets? There's a concern that the markets have been volatile over the last week. Any particular sectors that you're going to be looking at closely?
I'll break it up into 3 clusters for your friend Rajdeep. Depending on various outcomes in the speech over the next couple of hours, these are the sectors which will do well at least for a while in terms of sentiment. One is if the finance minister says that fiscal deficit is 6.8% this year, next year I bring it down to anywhere between 6.2 to 6.4%, and I stick to my target of getting to 4.5% by 2026. The result of that statement, which is returning to the path of fiscal moderation, will actually see bond yields cooling down, and that will be received well by banking stocks. So financial stocks will do well if fiscal deficit signals are on the way down. That's one way to read it. So that's one cluster for your friend. The other cluster is the finance minister says that I'm not in any hurry to bring down the fiscal deficit very significantly or very quickly. I will reduce it little bits at a time depending on how tax collections come about. But I want to focus more on growth. And she explicitly says that growth is a priority for me and therefore capex and not so much fiscal consolidation. Then banks will not do as well because interest rates will harden. What will do well is consumer discretionary stocks because she's focusing on growth, creating more jobs and income. That will stimulate demand. And consumer discretionary stocks, cars, consumables, those kind of consumer stocks will do well. And if she explicitly talks about capex spending in a big way, then I think, what is capex in India? Capex largely is roads, railways and defense. Then I would say defense is an important part here. So I would say then you would start to focus on some of the construction companies and some of the defense companies like Bharat Electronics, Hindustan Aeronautics, where capex in defense is going up. And that's an important political point that you guys might want to pick up. the way defense spending is going up now on capital expenditure because of the perceived threat or heightened threat perception from China. So defense might be an important part. So I would focus on defense and infrastructure stocks if there is an explicit commitment to capex in a big way in the budget. So banks, consumer discretionary, and infrastructure, depending on what she says, these are the three clusters I would look at closely.
That you're saying that defense spending is going up, because if I walk across to the budget intelligence dashboard and show our viewers how defense expenditure as a portion of our GDP is actually stagnant. It went up really fast during the Rajiv Gandhi years, but after that, if you look at defense spending, and I'm comparing here China, India and Pakistan. So the red line right at the top is China with $252 billion of investment. After that is India with 72.9 and Pakistan with 10.4, but it's a rather flat line. So the trend isn't one of an incline, it's a rather flat line. And this is as far as the overall defense spending is concerned. Let's now look at the defense GDP ratio, defense as a part of our total GDP. Here you're actually seeing defense spending as compared to our GDP coming down from 2.6% in FY16, went up to 2.9% in FY17, 3.1 in FY20 was the peak, and coming down to 2.2% in FY21. This despite the threat from China, this despite the mobilization of forces all the way from Ladakh to Arunachal Pradesh. Now remember, the government's logic here is that we're using our funds more judiciously. Earlier funds were wasted and therefore weren't adequately used. We're pushing Atmanirbhar Bharat and therefore trying to ensure that there is maximum bang for the buck. But the fact is that in comparison with other countries, we're still spending less, and in comparison with our own GDP, the percentage of spend on defense is actually coming down, and that is problematic. Saurav Majumdar joins us. Saurav is the editor of Business Today magazine, has been looking very carefully at the preparation for the budget. Saurav, you've looked at Nirmala Sitharaman's budgets in the past and the build-up to this budget. People who are watching at this time, your best sense of what they should expect from Nirmala Sitharaman in about 25 minutes from now?
Well, Rahul, I think we've had discussions on what the various options before her, but I think this time, and I would agree with Udayan, who has said yesterday and today, that we really need to focus on the MSMEs and the unorganized sector. I think that itself, talking about a positive element even before the elections, if she manages to give clear signals in terms of the support the government will lend to MSMEs, making them more export friendly, making their products, giving them better access to credit, and more importantly giving better access to technology, helping them become more self-sufficient in line with the overall Atmanirbhar Bharat theme. I think that itself will have a multiplier effect which can create jobs as well. So I think the MSME sector will be critical, and I would expect and hope that she will make some serious announcements to because that's a large multiplier, and that's a large and very strong sort of growth multiplier for the economy. Also, as we have discussed earlier, I think there is definitely a clear signal needed in terms of the roadmap for disinvestment, privatization and asset monetization. I think also expenditure going to productive segments, and we've again talked about earlier in the show as well as yesterday about expenditure lagging behind, actual expenditure lagging behind. So it's not just about announcements, we need clear signals and a roadmap. Budgets these days are not just about accounting. Budgets are also about setting the reform agenda, and this government has done fairly well on some of these aspects, like setting a roadmap for the future. They do believe in the barbell agile approach, the combination of the two, so they want to set a structure for the future. I think this budget, at least I will be looking forward to some clear signals in terms of what the next 2 to 3 years would be for the Indian economy, and definitely expenditure and support to MSMEs.
Well, then one of the things the economic survey speaks about is that a lot of the money that's being raised is actually being raised from the capital markets, not so much from bank credit. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? And what can the finance minister possibly do to nudge banks to lend more, and for private sector to actually go to banks asking them for more loans so that they can kickstart their investment projects?
It can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing, Rahul. I would say it's a two-edged thing, because this year might be a rougher year in a sense of raising capital, private equity capital or capital market funds for the kind of growth revival that you're talking about, because last year was very supportive in terms of private equity, in terms of companies coming to the market and raising capital. The IPO market was booming. I think this year might be more restrictive because of the kind of volatility that we're seeing in the global space. And therefore, the lens might turn to the banking sector, because credit growth is, while it is better than what it was a couple of years ago in 2020, I think it's still quite tepid by going by historical comparisons. And we do need a credit cycle in this country, a full-fledged credit cycle, because that has a kind of a multiplier effect. And I don't think we can have serious recovery and revival without bank credit picking up very significantly in this, or quite significantly in this country. And in that, there is a fly in the ointment, because while bank balance sheets are much better now than they were even a couple of years ago, and there is a huge amount of repair which has happened, I think there is a creeping problem of delinquencies which is creeping in because of the pandemic. And I think at the retail level, you will find that some warning signs are already beginning to flash, so far kept under the carpet. But I hope 2022 does not bring to the fore a fairly ugly consumer or retail delinquency cycle for the banking sector to face up to, because that would be very, very problematic. But this is one area which I would watch very, very carefully. Bank credit that you've just raised, and how it fleshes out, supporting the capex cycle that we all expect this year from the corporate space.
Udayan, you're saying that in a way, this is the ideal budget to perhaps for the finance minister to feel far more comfortable about the state of the economy compared to 21 and 20, which were budgets completely in the shadow of the pandemic. Now you've got vaccinations, you've got clear signs that the country's got Omicron under control. Shamika Ravi, in 20 and 21, the government could perhaps make the excuse that, look, we are in a pandemic, there have been lockdowns, that's been responsible for the slowing growth. This time, presumably, the government, in a sense, has a huge opportunity. Because if you look from 2017, post-demonetization, the economy slowed down. There have been serious question marks why quarter after quarter, and this stretches back to pre-pandemic levels, the government hasn't met its growth targets. Do you see 2022, therefore, as a huge opportunity for the government to, in a way, get back at the critics who say post-demonetization, this is an economy that has slowed down?
Well, Rajdeep, it's not just post-demonetization. I know you like to dwell on it, but I think what you ought to be really highlighting is the fact that for 10 years, private investments have not picked up. So there are structural problems. There are things that are so fundamentally broken, which is what the effort over the last 7-8 years have been to really mend it. So if you look at the banking system, or for that matter, just trying to get some of the regulations around easier flow of money out of bad assets in the, that has been a concern. But I get your point that clearly this year is better compared to the last 2 years, because we were firefighting, right? As a country, there were more emergency humanitarian supports. There were more from the point of view of making lives of ordinary people, easier from a day-to-day life perspective. So it was mostly health, food grains, cash support, etc. Now it's a bit different. I do think that the pandemic is receding. I think we have to look forward. We cannot be now struck just within that pandemic view of the world. But an important thing to remember is that earnings have fallen. Earnings have fallen particularly much more than national average for youths of Uttar Pradesh. Now, these are the kind of things that should weigh in on this budget, and I'm hoping, and I'm guessing it will. Because, of course, in a democracy, eventually governments do respond to these kind of emergencies. But while unemployment for the youth is generally a longer-term problem, it has worsened after the pandemic. But the earnings have worsened in some areas far more than the others. And UP on that count has suffered. And that's why when I say a welfareist budget is what my expectation is, it's not about urban Narega. In fact, I would unequivocally say that urban Narega is a bad idea. I don't think, in fact, the better response would be just strengthening SMEs and making it feasible for MSMEs to go back to business as usual, or just growing, the kind of things that Udayan has been talking about since yesterday. I think those are the right measures. But
from Parliament,
still,
that the cabinet meeting is over.
Right? These are big
The cabinet has approved the union budget, which is a formality that is required before the budget is presented by the finance minister on the floor of the House. That starts in about 23 minutes. We've also got Supriya Shrineth of the Congress who's joining us. We've heard from the opposition. We've heard from the government. We can get a word from the opposition. Those are images from a little earlier of Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman at the gate of the Parliament building, going in with her team as she presents her budget.